Hello, I'm Anastasia, and I'm so glad you're here tonight. We're about to slip into one of history's quieter corners, the forgotten lives and quiet resilience of Rome's working women, those who moved through the candlelit alleys of the eternal city, earning their place in history through whispers, coin, and sheer endurance. From hidden brothels carved into stone walls to courtesans who dined with emperors, this is a story of survival, strange economics, and the ancient business of intimacy. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I share here, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's such a joy to see this little sleepy corner of the world come to life each night. Now dim the lights, pull the blanket a little higher, and let's ease into tonight's story together. Because in ancient Rome, not all professions wore togas. Let's begin our story, not in the heart of Rome, but in a city that time preserved by accident. Pompeii. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it sealed more than villas and bathhouses beneath layers of ash. It preserved a window, a moment, a forgotten world. And tucked quietly among the ruins was a small building, discreet in shape, but bold in purpose. The Lupanar, Rome's word for a brothel, from lupa, meaning she-wolf, a nickname, a warning, and a social judgment, all rolled into one. The women who worked there were not seen as people. They were branded with metaphors, and their workplaces looked the part. 10 rooms, 2 floors, stone beds built directly into the walls, curtains if you were lucky. Privacy? A concept more modern than marble countertops. Each room was barely large enough to turn around in, just wide enough for a man to forget the weight of the world and a woman to carry it for him. The walls were painted with colorful, unapologetic frescoes, not religious, not romantic, instructional. Here, intimacy was a transaction, not a secret. This wasn't a place for lovers, it was a place for customers. And they came, in sandals with coins in hand. The going rate? About 2 donkeys. Yes, that was the real currency. The ass, small bronze coins, roughly the price of a loaf of bread or a cup of wine. In ancient Rome, love was cheaper than breakfast. But this wasn't lawless. Rome, ever the fan of order, taxed brothels. Prostitutes had to register with the authorities. Some even carried licenses stamped with their profession. Others were enslaved, owned by brothel keepers, given no choice, no contract, and no way out. In the Lupanar, business boomed. No perfume could mask the scent of sweat, wine, and damp stone. And yet people came, again and again. They carved messages into the walls, graffiti like "Marcia was here" or "Felix is the best." The Yelp reviews of the ancient world. Some were proud, some were cruel, some were just trying to leave a mark in a world that refused to remember them by name. The Lupanar wasn't the only brothel in Pompeii, but it's the one that survived, not by praise, but by ash. And because of that, we see what history usually hides: the labor, the rules, the women, and the economy that ran quietly under Rome's marble surface. This was a business, one built on bodies, one maintained by laws, and one accepted, as long as no one talked about it too loudly. But we will, gently, because these women, these lupae, deserve to be heard even in a whisper. So let's step outside the brothel now, into the world of the Meretrix, the professional courtesans, the contract-bound companions, the ones who could climb the social ladder, if only one step at a time. If the lupa was the she-wolf of Rome's back alleys, the Meretrix was her more polished cousin, not hidden, not hushed, but legal, and in some cases, proudly listed in official records. The term Meretrix simply meant a woman who earns, a transactional title for a transactional life. But in Rome, even among the marginalized, there was hierarchy. Not all courtesans were created equal. Some worked in brothels, some worked alone, and some entertained men of power in villas with gardens, reclining on cushions instead of stone beds. You see, the Meretrix could technically be her own boss. She could own property. She could draft contracts. She could sue and be sued in court. In fact, many meretrices had clients who signed formal agreements, a set number of meetings, a certain level of discretion, a regular stipend. Sound romantic? Not quite. Rome was fond of love poetry, yes, but not of love. Marriage was for producing heirs. Passion was outsourced. Some courtesans became muses to poets, companions to generals, or quiet fixtures in the lives of senators. But they were never fully accepted. No matter how witty, beautiful, or educated, a meretrix was still a meretrix. Legally, she could never marry a Roman citizen if she worked publicly, and if a Roman man married one, he could lose his own social status, a rather severe punishment for following his heart. Even elite meretrices, known for their charm or clever conversation, were always one misstep away from disgrace. A scandal, a jealous wife, a political enemy. And suddenly she was out, replaced, forgotten, or worse, punished. And yet, they persisted. Some kept detailed account books, some trained other girls, some saved enough money to retire, to live in comfort, or even to free others from slavery. There were famous names too. Courtesans known throughout the city for their wit, their wealth, or the chaos they caused in high places. One, it said, charged a fortune for a single night and turned down an emperor for not offering enough. Because power, it turns out, flows both ways, even in a city ruled by men, coins, and caution. But being a meretrix wasn't glamorous. It was calculated. It was risky. And it was survival. She might wear jewelry. She might quote poetry. She might dine on figs and honeyed wine. But beneath it all was the same thing that pulsed through the brothel walls, an unspoken truth. In Rome, bodies were currency, and the market never closed. Now, not all women of the night worked in shadows or salons. Some worked right in the open, on the street corners, under archways, where business flowed with the crowd. In the next segment, we'll wander into that world, not polished, not hidden, but loud, raw, and entirely public. Not every woman in Rome's pleasure trade had a room. Many had only a corner, a wall, an archway, a patch of pavement beneath the moon. This was the realm of the nocturnal freelancers, those who didn't work in the Lupanar or by contract, but simply made themselves available. They were the women you passed in the marketplace by day and saw leaning casually against stone pillars by night. The ones who wore red-dyed tunics, not because they liked the color, but because the law required it. Yes, Rome, ever the bureaucratic empire, had a color code for shame. Prostitutes, by edict, were to wear garments that marked them out. So, a crimson tunic, not a fashion statement, a label, the kind you couldn't take off. And yet, the streets were full, not just with women, but with demand. Rome was a crowded, sleepless city. Fires always smoldering, taverns always spilling over, and somewhere, always someone willing to pay for 10 minutes of warmth. The women working these corners were often independent, not slaves, not brothel-owned, but their independence was thin protection. They had no guard, no lock on a door, no protection if a client turned violent, only their words, their instincts, and their reputation. Many worked near fornaces, the stone archways, under bridges or aqueducts, which, yes, is where we get the word fornication, a reminder that language, like history, remembers what it wants to, and often in the most revealing ways. Clients came and went in the night like shadows. Some came in cloaks, careful not to be seen. Some were drunk, laughing too loudly. Some were ashamed. Some were not. Coins were exchanged quickly, sometimes before, sometimes after, sometimes never, if the woman wasn't fast enough. And yet they came, because it was money, because it was survival, because there was no other option. The streets were alive with voices, vendors selling bread long past fresh, men brawling near bathhouses, and above it all the echo of sandals on stone. In that noise the women blended in, part of the rhythm of the night, unseen unless needed, unheard unless whispered to, and in the morning they vanished, back into homes shared with aging parents, into rented rooms where silence was cheaper than honesty, or into temples pretending to pray, hoping perhaps the gods weren't watching the night before. But Rome was always watching, even when it pretended not to see. And those women, with red tunics and tired eyes, were part of the city's machinery, not honored, not protected, but essential. As essential as the baker, the butcher, the builder, the senator. Because every empire, no matter how golden its statues, relies on invisible hands to hold up the marble. Next, we'll meet the courtesans who broke that invisibility, who became famous, even infamous, whose names passed through dinner parties and poetry salons like forbidden fruit, the ones who mastered the art of survival, not just with their bodies, but with their words. In a world that rarely remembered its women, especially those who lived by coin and candlelight, a few names still slipped through the cracks, whispered in taverns, scribbled in poems, etched into marble hearts, and a few stone walls. Not many, but enough to remind us, even in a society built on silence, some women made themselves impossible to ignore. Let's begin with Volumnia Cytheris, a freed woman, once enslaved, who became a celebrated meretrix in the 1st century BCE. She was elegant, educated, articulate, and for a brief time the lover of Mark Antony. Yes, that Mark Antony. Long before Cleopatra entered the stage in eyeliner and legend, it was Cytheris who walked beside him on his triumphal return to Rome, arm in arm, in public. Scandalous, absolutely, but also bold and utterly unheard of. Roman generals did not parade their courtesans through the streets, but Antony did, and Cytheris held her head high, a woman once enslaved, now dining with senators. Of course, it didn't last. Scandals rarely do, but her name lived on, in gossip, in verse, in the footnotes of men who thought they were the main characters. Then there was Faustina, known for her beauty, and her lawsuits. She once sued a lover for breach of contract, not for failing to love her, but for failing to pay her. A woman after Rome's own heart, passionate about justice and punctual payments. Some women made fortunes, others reputations, and a few, the cleverest of all, made both. They learned when to flatter, when to flirt, and when to disappear. They spoke Greek to the philosophers, Latin to the lawyers, and silence to the wives of senators. And let's not forget Clodia Metelli, nicknamed the Medea of the Palatine by her critics. She was no courtesan by trade, but her reputation danced on the edge of it. Poets like Catullus immortalized her in verses dripping with heartbreak, obsession, and enough innuendo to make a toga blush. Was she truly scandalous, or simply powerful, and punished for it? It's hard to say, because Rome rarely wrote down a woman's truth, only the version that suited the men around her. Still, their names echo in surviving scrolls, in poetry so bitter it must have once been sweet, in the empty spaces between honor and infamy, where a clever woman could build an empire of her own without ever sitting on a throne. Next, we turn to the legal scrolls, to rules, branding irons, and the little-known bureaucracy of Rome's intimate economy. Because if you thought Rome let anything happen without paperwork, you haven't met its licensing system. Rome, the city of law, the empire of structure. A civilization so devoted to rules it couldn't sleep without a scroll of regulations tucked beside its bronze pillow. And when it came to the business of desire, Rome treated it with the same meticulous attention it gave to aqueducts, grain shipments, and yes, even sewer maintenance. You see, the ancient Romans may not have believed in equality, but they absolutely believed in paperwork. Let's start with attire. As we mentioned before, women in the sex trade were required, by law, to wear the tunicum muliebri, a specific kind of red or saffron-colored garment. It wasn't stylish, it wasn't optional, it was a uniform of shame, a wearable announcement. This woman is not respectable. And yet, some wore it with defiance, others with resignation. But all of them wore it under the watchful eyes of the law. Then there was the registry. In order to legally work as a prostitute in Rome, whether in a brothel or independently, a woman had to register with the aedles, Rome's public officials. This wasn't a simple name-on-a-list situation. Of course not. It involved providing your personal details, agreeing to the terms, and being entered into official records, forever marked as a meretrix. No turning back, no appealing the label. Even if a woman changed her life, married, moved, became a mother, her past once recorded remained etched in the public archive. Because forgiveness was not a Roman virtue, at least not when it came to women. And then came the taxes. Because of course there were taxes. Prostitution in ancient Rome was not just tolerated, it was profitable. And the empire never missed an opportunity to dip its fingers into someone else's business. In fact, under Emperor Caligula, yes, that Caligula, a tax on prostitution was formally introduced. Every transaction, every night's work was supposed to be taxed. The logic? If the state allowed it, the state should benefit from it. Sound familiar? Even in ancient times, revenue was revenue, no matter how it was earned or how many red tunics were involved. Brothel owners, too, had responsibilities. They were required to keep order, prevent disturbances, and, in theory, protect their workers. In practice, most were interested only in profit. Protection was inconsistent, abuse was common, and recourse was rare. Still, some courtesans kept ledgers, some brothels employed accountants, some transactions were recorded with as much precision as temple donations. Because if love was fleeting, revenue was eternal. Rome taxed the body as it taxed grain and land and perfume. It counted every coin, but never counted the cost. So while senators gave speeches about morality and marble statues glowed under the sun, Rome's bureaucrats were busy, calculating, cataloging, and quietly profiting from the very thing they pretended not to see. Now, let's move from laws to loopholes, to the strange hypocrisy of Roman society, where elite men could purchase pleasure, but the women who provided it could never be truly accepted. We'll step into that contradiction, where scandal and status shared a dinner table and dignity had a curfew. Ah, Rome, the land of marble temples, stoic philosophy, and spectacular double standards, a place where a senator could lecture on morality by day and tiptoe into a brothel by night. In full toga, of course, because in the eternal city, the rules of reputation were less about what you did and more about who you were while doing it. Let's start with the men. A Roman citizen, a man of good standing, was expected to uphold virtue, dignity, and proper decorum. Naturally, this included the freedom to enjoy the services of courtesans, lupae, dancers, slaves, and even boys, as long as he did so quietly, paid for it, and maintained a certain smug expression while doing it. No shame, no social penalty. In fact, it was often assumed, even encouraged, that a man should fulfill his needs outside of marriage. Wives were for lineage. Everyone else? That was where the fun was. But now flip the coin. What if a woman, even a freeborn Roman woman, stepped into the same world? Disaster. If she became a meretrix, her legal status changed permanently. She lost the right to marry a respectable man. She could not claim inheritance or social legitimacy. She was forever marked, not just by law, but by culture. And while a male client could go from brothel to Senate floor without a raised eyebrow, a woman who so much as worked near a brothel could be considered impure. Worse, if a citizen's daughter was accused, even falsely, of having worked as a prostitute, she could be legally disowned, barred from marriage, and cut off from society. It didn't matter whether she chose the work or was forced into it. Rome wasn't particularly interested in nuance. And then, of course, there were the wives. Proper Roman matrons were expected to be silent, obedient, and modest. They were not to be seen at the theater, at dinner parties, or certainly anywhere near where courtesans might be present. To be a respectable woman meant being invisible in all the places men enjoyed being loud. And yet, the system needed these other women, the ones who spoke freely, entertained, seduced, and listened. The empire ran on contradiction, moral purity in the home, pleasure in the shadows, and silence everywhere else. Even the poets knew this. Writers like Ovid, Martial, and Catullus wrote verses praising their lovers one moment and mocking them the next. To be desired was acceptable. To be desiring, dangerous. To sell pleasure was legal. To talk about it was not. And yet, without the women of the night, without the courtesans, the freelancers, the performers, the unnamed, Rome would not have been Rome. Because in every marble city, behind every stoic philosophy, there's a human truth. People seek comfort, and society pretends not to. In the next part, we'll leave the legal scrolls behind and walk the late-night streets again to see how these women lived, worked, and disappeared back into the dark before sunrise. This is where shadows meet survival, and reputation is always on the line. We've heard their names, the famous few. We've seen their red tunics. But what about the hours between customers? The spaces behind the curtain? The silence between footsteps? Where did they go when the coins stopped clinking? For most women in Rome's pleasure trade, life was not lived in candlelight and poetry. It was lived in shared spaces, damp walls, and the unyielding rhythm of survival. If she worked in a brothel, she likely slept on the very same stone bed she used for clients. No separate quarters, no privacy, no soft blanket tucked around her shoulders when the last man left. Just cold walls, a thin cloth, and a moment to close her eyes, if no one else was waiting. The brothel never truly slept. Someone was always coming, or leaving, or knocking. And for those who worked the streets, they returned to rented rooms, shared with other women, or servants, or sometimes entire families who didn't ask questions. Or they paid for a night on a straw mat in a crowded lodging house, where snores and coughing echoed louder than any dream. Some slept under fornaces, the stone arches that had no doors, just a bit of shadow and enough space to pretend they were safe. There were no locks, no escape from the night's chill, and no law that cared if they disappeared. Their lives were delicate balances. Too successful, and they risked drawing attention from jealous wives or watchful officials. Too poor, and they slipped into debt, where violence and forced labor waited. They were often excluded from temples, from guilds, from public baths, because sin, though taxed, was also contagious, apparently. And still they survived. They learned how to read faces, how to spot danger before it stepped too close, how to charm, retreat, negotiate, vanish. They kept secrets, held grudges, formed bonds with other women who knew what it meant to be visible and invisible at once. Many had children, some theirs by choice, some by force, rarely acknowledged, seldom remembered. Some mothers hid their work, others didn't bother. In a world that offered them no dignity, there was no illusion to protect. And yet, here's the strange part. In their cramped corners and shadowed rooms, some found laughter, shared wine, whispered stories. Because even among the discarded, there was life, messy, tired, fleeting, but still life. Rome did not write down how they lived, only how they were taxed. But history lingers in the spaces between ledgers, in the graffiti left behind, in the silence no one expected to echo for 2,000 years. In our next segment, we'll return to those marks, the surviving traces, the names scratched into walls, and what they reveal about the humanity behind the profession. Because when society forgets you sometimes, you carve your name into stone. History often favors the grand, emperors, generals, marble statues with perfect posture. But in Pompeii, it was the walls that remembered the rest of us. The stone walls, the bathhouse stalls, the brothel door frames, scratched with longing, laughter, and names. You see, In a world where women of the night were denied books, scrolls, and monuments, they carved their truths wherever they could, in plaster, in pigment, in passing remarks etched with a nail. Graffiti. Not vandalism, not art, just memory. Refusing to disappear. In the Lupanar, many of these markings remain. Some are humorous. I had the best time with Maritima, or Successus loves Iris, even if she doesn't return the coin. Some are sharp. Watch your toga, Courtesans. You're not as charming as you think. Some are hauntingly plain. Here I was. And some are signed. A name. Just a name. Felicia, Theodora, Restituta, Callista. Were they real names? Stage names? Names borrowed, traded, or forced? We don't know. But we know this. They wanted to be remembered. And somehow, across centuries of silence, they succeeded. Some graffiti advertised services. Others left ratings, like an ancient Roman Yelp, marking which woman smiled, which was fast, which was worth your last 2 asses. There was no shame in being reviewed, only in being forgotten. Some marks were crude, others surprisingly poetic. One fragment found above a bed simply read, "Here, Venus smiled." A small phrase, a quiet triumph, perhaps written by a client, perhaps by the woman herself, rewriting the story, even for a moment. And then there were the drawings, simple lines, crude hearts, figures in embrace, little traces that said, I existed. Because if Rome refused to speak their names, they would write them down themselves. And while no marble statue was raised for these women, they left something better, an echo. Stone cannot lie. It preserves what ink and scrolls ignore. And in the walls of Pompeii, in the carved corners of forgotten cities, their voices still murmur. Not loudly, not proudly, but honestly. And perhaps that's the kind of history we need most. The kind that wasn't meant to survive, but did anyway. In our next segment, we'll explore what happened to these women when the years passed. When beauty faded, coins slowed, and the city no longer looked their way. Because Rome had no pension plan for the women who built its quietest economy. What happens when the curtain falls, when the laughter fades from the tavern, the coins stop clinking, and the red tunic no longer fits the same? In ancient Rome, aging was rarely kind. But for the women who worked in its shadows, time was not just unkind, it was dangerous. There were no retirement funds, no savings plans, no soft landings. Beauty, in this business, was currency. And like all currency, it lost value over time. Some women, the fortunate few, saved enough. They purchased freedom, bought homes, or opened their own establishments, not of pleasure, but of bread, cloth, wine. A few became linas, brothel keepers, trading their labor for management. A harder life in some ways, but one that carried a little more control and a little more distance. Others became nurses, or wet nurses, or midwives, if they had learned enough from experience and pain. But most simply disappeared, without family, without husband, without legal standing. A woman who aged out of Rome's intimate economy often faded into poverty or debt. And debt in Rome was a fast road to slavery. Some returned to the temples, not to pray, but to beg. Because the gods, it seems, had better pensions than the state. Some stayed in the brothels, working longer than their bodies could bear, because leaving meant hunger. Others clung to the hope of a patron, a kind one, a foolish one, or simply one who owed them more than a few coins. And some simply vanished from record. No grave, no mention, only silence. And yet, we still find traces, tombs bearing simple inscriptions. She was kind. She was free. She lived, not much, but more than many had. The curtain never truly rose on their lives, and yet it fell, quietly, just the same. History didn't write them endings, so we do, not to romanticize, but to remember, to say that they mattered, that survival was a form of resistance, that love, even if borrowed, left echoes in the stone. Next, in our final segment, we'll return to where we began, to the streets, the walls, the whispers, and we'll ask, what did Rome build with all that pleasure, and what did it leave behind? So here we are. We've wandered through brothels and alleyways, past red tunics and crumbling frescoes, through whispers and tax ledgers, and into the lives of women Rome tried so hard to forget. And yet, they're still here, in the scratched names, in the stone beds, in the laughter etched into plaster walls. They weren't saints. They weren't queens. They weren't even meant to be remembered, but they were human, and that is enough. They lived where the city turned its face away, but they kept surviving, one client at a time, one coin at a time, one long, quiet night at a time. And maybe that's why they still echo, not because history honored them, but because they wrote themselves into it anyway. With chalk, with curses, with love letters carved into stone. Rome had its emperors, its legions, its triumphs. But under all of that, and in the cracks between marble, there were women, red-dressed, sharp-tongued, tired-eyed, brilliant, forgotten, unforgettable. So tonight, we leave them there, in their corner of the eternal city, not to judge, not to pity, but simply to acknowledge that they were part of it all, as real as the aqueducts, as constant as the Forum, as Roman as Rome itself. Close your eyes now. Let the noise of the street fade, the flicker of lamplight, the shuffle of sandals, the soft hush of fabric drawn across a stone doorway. Let it all drift into the quiet. You are safe, you are resting, and the story is done. Good night from the back alleys of Rome, and thank you for remembering them.